Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. We are eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. My guest today is Helen Immordino-Yang. Dr. Immordino-Yang studies the psychological and neurological basis of social emotion, self-awareness, and culture, and their implications for learning, development, and schools. She is professor of education at the USC Rosier School of Education, a professor of psychology at the Brain and Creativity Institute, a member of the Neuroscience Graduate Program faculty at the University of Southern California, and director of USC Center for Affective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, and Education. Dr. Immordino-Yang, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I would love to hear you say some things about what was it about your own life experience that drew you into the place that you now find yourself. I would love to hear some things about that.
Like all of us, I have a complicated history. I guess what I would say is that as a child, I grew up on a farm in rural Connecticut that my parents kind of put together. And my father was a physician, and my mom had been a teacher but stayed home with us. And they decided that they were going to raise their kids growing what we eat, basically, as a way to kind of counter or sort of, enrich the ways that my parents had both grown up in inner city Detroit and inner city Yonkers, respectively. And there was also really a strong international focus, I think, in our family. We always had visiting young people and political dissidents and, from all over the world kind of landing at our place and staying for various amounts of time. And so I really got very interested in, different ways of knowing and thinking about the human experience. And I guess I could also say that I was a kid for whom school didn't work very well. Obviously I have a doctorate from Harvard now and I'm a full professor at a major university. So I managed to do okay. But it was
Apparently,
kind of in spite of the system. I mean, I really was very unhappy at school as a kid. I just really didn't feel like the ways that we were expected to pace ourselves, the kind of out in approach where teachers give you things and you return it on command. The kinds of individualized achievement and, me, kind of approach to schooling just really did not sit well with me. I've always been a very sort of soft and social person, not in an outgoing way, but in a more kind of relational way, and very interested in what it feels like to be a human and how people construct those feelings together. So, throughout my life, I really, as soon as I was old enough, which was probably too young, I started going abroad and living with families around the world. When I was 13, my parents helped me to get into a summer program where I stayed with a family in France for a month. And that was the first time that I kind of went abroad and used some of my language skills and fit into a different family and saw what that was like. But then over time, I did more and more of that, more and more independently. I lived in Kenya for 8 months. I was in Russia working with children who were living on the streets, who had been picked up and moved into a homeless camp in southern Siberia. I lived with a family in Ireland. I went back to France to do some schooling there. I just was kind of all over the place, engaging with people. I myself worked as a carpenter for a while as a young person after graduating college, because I was very interested in boat building and woodworking, and mainly what I was mostly interested in this, aside from the craft itself, was the ways that people kind of construct meaning and knowledge in these open spaces, right? In these ill-formed problem domains, like how do we figure out how to build a boat out of trees, and how do we teach each other what we figured out, and how do we use those boats then to sustain a lifestyle, right? Beyond just the people building them, and those kinds of interactions and cultural kind of negotiations were very, very interesting to me. When I was in Kenya, I was living for a good part of the time with a fundamentalist Muslim family. This was on an island off the coast of northern Kenya called Lamu, which was at that time very, very fundamentalist Muslim. Women wear complete burqas with only their eyes showing, for example. And I was, living with those women and actually in their households and in their beds with them, like sharing their living arrangements, and really being part of that, as I was at the same time working during the day for, as a boat builder, which is an entirely male profession. So really seeing these very different sides of a community, and just trying to figure out what was going on and who I was in that, and how humans kind of think and feel together, has really driven, I think, my work now. I mean, I didn't know that it would at the time. um, and then I got into teaching as a young adult, for a series of reasons, which are kind of not that interesting. But I was a carpenter, and I cut my hand at a job site, and I needed to take some time off to heal that. And I thought, how am I going to support myself at the ripe old age of 23? So I, basically applied to the Massachusetts Department of Education and said, look, there are schools in South Boston that don't have enough teachers. I could, with mentorship, be qualified, and basically managed to land myself a position teaching full-time seventh grade science in a junior senior high school south of Boston. And that was just beyond any of my expectations, how interesting that was.
You've described in just a few minutes what most people don't cover in their entire lifetimes in terms of your own life experience, and so I want to uh, turn our attention just because everything that you've said so far is just a treasure trove of life experience. And I would love to hear. Tell us more. Like I believe I'm listening to someone who has been formed by her life in really meaningful ways. And speaking of meaning, when it came then to your moving toward being curious about and doing work in the field of education, I would love for you to tell us more about how then does this whole notion of meaning making and how we learn and what makes learning, what is it about the place of making meaning? How's that attached to learning? And what do you see as current trends that you think would be important for us to be hearing in terms of what does it mean for schools and families to enable children's minds to flourish, especially as it has to do with this question of how we make meaning out of things?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the question. So, what I felt as a child in school, and what I saw with my own students when I began teaching in an incredibly diverse school district with kids coming in from all over the world. The Rwandan refugee crisis had just happened. There were kids coming from Haiti, there were kids coming from the Caribbean and from Southeast Asia and from Eastern Europe. There was just a constellation of different cultural and ethnic groups coming together in my science classroom. Is what I found so fascinating as I engaged with that, as someone who had always really been in love with the natural world and just very, very interested in understanding and appreciating the beauty of the systems of nature that surround us. And sharing that with kids, and watching how it was that their own meaning making processes seemed to be unfolding, how they were struggling to make sense out of their immigration stories, their own cultural heritage, their own relationships, those of the kids around them who looked and ate and dressed differently than they did and talked differently than they did. How did that all come together for them, and how were they using my class, and scientific content and ways of knowing about problems in the world and ways of thinking systematically about evidence, and learning to notice, right, which is what we were focusing on. How were they using those skills to make sense of their own broader life stories? And it really piqued my interest in this notion of how people's stories, how we construct narratives in our minds, and how those narrative construction processes, which are emotional feelings that have been elaborated by cognitions and perspections, imaginings of the future and interpretations of the past and of others' intentions and perspectives and our own intentions and perspectives, how all of those come together and are woven into a feeling of being me, into a story about what it all means. And I became fascinated to understand those processes in the developmental process and how they could be supported more effectively in schooling. And so I went back to graduate school to begin to study that. But as I did, I realized also, as I was engaging with young people, talking to them, looking at the ways that they made sense and understood things and tried to understand the intersections between cognitive and emotional and social and cultural development, right? That the theories we were building in education and in human development, had at some level to be commensurate with the ways that these young people's brains and bodies were developing, with the biology that was supporting these emerging ways of feeling and being with one another and relating and ultimately of making stories and meaning. And so I thought, let's learn about what how the brain development is shaped by culture, is shaped by emotional experience, is shaped by sociality, and bring those insights back to bear on what we're seeing in developmental contexts like schools. As I started to look into that, which wasn't that long ago, it was in just around the early 2000s. What I found very quickly is that there was almost nothing known about culture in the brain. Emotion had been studied mainly as like, we shine a snake in your face and see if watch your amygdala light up, right? And I was thinking of something a little more nuanced,
It's always fun to hear.
and the things around identity and cultural experience and relationships, those really had not been studied neurologically. And so I thought, okay, well, I need to understand those things in order to really get a whole picture of what's happening with our children, and so that we can support them. And that's the direction that my work went at that point.
I'm wondering if I were a parent of young children or a parent even of teenagers, and you really wanted them to hear some important things about what's significant, what's important for them to be paying attention to. That you've named some crucially important things. This storytelling process, one, the process of the brain body development, the process of learning in open settings, as opposed to kind of our common notion of I'm going to give you a bunch of information that you're just going to spit back to me on a test. I would love for you to connect what are some things that you've discovered that are important, and connect that with what are some bullets that you would really want people to know on behalf of their kids as they are shepherding their kids into their next developmental stages, whether these kids are in elementary school or teenagers or even in college.
Oh yeah, even well into young adulthood, right? I think what is so striking and fundamental about what we've discovered about these processes is that um, the narratives that people construct, especially young people, right, is where we've really studied this for its developmental, right, sort of affordances. When we did a longitudinal study of kids from inner city Los Angeles who, are doing well, they're doing fine, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids in ninth and 10th grade. And we sat down with them and talk to them about how they understand their lives, how they understand the gang violence and crime they learn about in their neighborhoods, how they think about their futures, their families, their ethnic identities, their spirituality, their relationships, all manner of topics. And we also did neuroimaging with those kids as they thought about complex social scenarios of teenagers' stories from around the world, and told us how they were feeling about them. And then we followed up with those kids 2 years later when they were juniors and seniors in high school, and then again when they were young adults. And what we found was really quite striking, and that is that, we also measured IQ, we measured their family's income to needs ratio, how much money per person in the household. We asked about their parents' education levels and things like that. And none of those things predicted brain development nearly to the degree that the kids' own meaning making did. So, in other words, by the ways that young people engaged with the stories of other young people and sort of their dispositional curiosity about what they could learn from the story of Malala in Pakistan, right? Their dispositional curiosity about a young man in Senegal who can't afford to go to school, but ends up learning how to invent all kinds of electronics and batteries for his community so that people can better their conditions by using garbage out of the junkyard, right? I mean, when they engaged with those stories, you know, kids engaged directly with them. They said, "Oh, I feel bad for her," things like that. But then they went beyond that and they started to spontaneously reflect on the meaning for their own lives, the broader lesson they could extract, the moral implications, the ethical implications for how the world works or how it should or could work, and what I could do maybe to make it go in a better direction, right? And what role I could play. And what we found is that all kids did that in our study. 65 kids all did that to a degree, but some of them did it much more than others. And the more they did that, the more their brains actually grew in all kinds of beneficial ways over the following 2 years. So it's almost like kids were showing us that they were bringing a kind of inclination or disposition or drive to think deeply about the implications and the social and moral and ethical and emotional implications of situations in the world, and to try to build from that a deeper meaning about what it means to be a human being and what it means to be me, and what kind of sense of purpose and values I should build, and what kinds of things I should strive to accomplish and to help others with, given what I'm learning about the social world. And what we found is that that brain growth was independent of IQ, right? So it didn't matter how much money the kid's family had, how high the kid's IQ was, how much even education their parents had. It mattered that they were curious and deeply emotionally engaged with thinking about complex issues. And as they did that, we saw their brains growing over the 2 years. And in turn, that brain growth was statistically explaining, so to speak, like predicting how happy they were as young adults, how much their identity was centered around sort of moral and values-based and relational, pro-social ideas, as compared to kind of instrumental ideas like, oh, I want to go to college, instead saying like, I want to help my community, and I think one way I could do that is by becoming a pediatrician, and so I need to go to college, right? A much more sort of values-driven approach to their life planning. And they liked themselves better. They liked their close partners and relationships better. They had a stronger sense of identity the more their brains had grown in these patterns. So what it really tells us is that the way young people feel and think about the social world is instrumental to the way in which they grow and develop over time. And as a parent, what that means to me is I really need to take seriously the ways that my children are thinking about and feeling about the things they witness, and then help them to sculpt those reflections into stories that they generate. Like, you can't give it to them. Stories that they generate that facilitate them coming to inferences about their own self, their own sense of purpose, their own understanding of what is good and goodness, and how they should dispositionally grow their own identities and selves to be able to be contributing in a beneficial way to their community and their their world, that actually really matters. It's not about what you do or what you know nearly so much as it is about how you think and your own curiosity for engaging with other people's differences, for making sense out of others' perspectives, for sitting with uncomfortable situations and really having the patience to understand those around you and to think with them about your shared values and beliefs and how you can construct a world together. Those dispositions led to brain growth and to wellness, which really I think is a powerful statement for young people's own meaning making in their flourishing.
Yeah, I live in Northern Virginia, where as it wouldn't be surprising to you that it's not the question of will my kid go to college, it's will my kid get into Yale, and all the questions that come about, and what are our SAT scores and all the things. And I'm also aware that our listeners have just heard a really powerful testimony for why it's significant for adults themselves to be curious about their own stories in such a way that they can then practice helping to foster that curiosity in their own kids in the way that you've talked about, to help them strengthen this way of being more nuanced, more robust, more full in the way that they are actually quote unquote learning about things in the world. And yeah, I can't tell you how grateful I am. I know that this has been a short conversation, far shorter than I want it to be, and perhaps we can do this again. I'm just so grateful. I'm not just grateful for your being on our podcast. I'm really also grateful for just the hard work that you're doing. And like, yes, you've got research data now that's telling us, but like, that research data has come because you've put in a lot of long, hard hours, and I know how that works. And so I want to thank you for the hard work, as well as the information that's coming from it that you can share with us that will enable us to live lives that are flourishing in the world. Thank you so much, Mary Helen. It's been great to have you with us, and I hope to talk again soon.
All right, me too.
You've been listening to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and today my guest has been Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, Professor of Psychology at the University of Southern California. I look forward to your joining us for our next episode this season, as we continue our journey to explore life at the intersection of neuroscience in the light of following Jesus.